I'm so excited to be joined on the podcast with Chloe Valdary. For those who don't know, those people that have been living under a rock, Chloe is an American writer and entrepreneur who is best known for her company, her organization, the Theory of Enchantment, which I'm sure we're going to get into in the conversation. But just in the crux, it teaches social and emotional learning in schools, as well as diversity and inclusion in many companies and government agencies. And she has written and discussed and spoken very eloquently on many of the issues that we talk about on the Equiano Project: race, identity politics, racism, and anti-racism. So first and foremost, thank you so much, Chloe, for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so I think just to give a little bit of a background before we dive into the issues, what got you involved in the discussion about race and racism? Because I think I first came across you, I can't remember exactly, but I think it was this Black intellectual diversity panel, several years ago, basically in 2020, when all of those debates about BLM were coming out, and there was these great alternative thinkers, Coleman Hughes, who we were very close to, Thomas Chatton Williams, John McWhorter, etc. And I saw you as part of that intellectual milieu that was providing a different perspective. So give us a bit of a background about how you came to be so prominent in this discussion.
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, that was a Black Intellectual Roundtable hosted by Brett Weinstein in 2020, in the summer of 2020, when a lot of Black Lives Matter protests were happening, certainly around the United States. This is also a time of incredible experiences of isolation and alienation because of the shutdowns from COVID. And how did I end up in that space? I mean, I had known many of those individuals for a while. I certainly knew Brett for a bit. And I had introduced Brett to the theory of enchantment prior to that experience. I spoke with him before about the theory of enchantment. And I developed the theory of enchantment actually not in response to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I originally developed it as a response to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which unfortunately has metastasized currently in the current moment that we're speaking. And my major was international studies. My concentration was conflict and diplomacy, and I wanted to develop a way or an ecology of practices that would teach us how to love. And I was very grateful for the degree that I got in international studies, but I noticed that all of the solutions that were being proposed to end conflict or to mitigate conflict were bereft of the very simple yet profound language of learning how to love. And so it was within the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that I developed these three principles that would be a sort of barometer or signposts to hold myself accountable to. And those three principles are: treat people like human beings, not political abstractions; criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down or destroy; and try to root everything you do in love and compassion. And I think the essence of these three principles is a fundamental awareness that we as human beings are all interconnected. And I think it's so easy to forget this. I think it actually is a coping mechanism to deal with pain, the forgetting of this. But this is really what Theory of Enchantment is trying to push. And though it sort of became noticed by many companies in 2020 that were looking for alternatives to the kind of, what would you call it, Kendi, Robin DiAngelo model of diversity and inclusion that was taking over many workplaces in the United States and around the world, quite frankly. So many companies were looking for an alternative to the sort of scarcity-based approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they found Theory of Enchantment. So Theory of Enchantment is a response to international conflict. It is a response to conflict that emerges interpersonally. It is a response to conflict that emerges between groups of different ethnic backgrounds. But its fundamental spirit, a warning that it is trying to get people to heed, is to remember that we are all interconnected as a species, and to root our approach to one another, our being with one another, in love and compassion.
Okay, no, that's very, very interesting. And I really appreciate that detailed summary, and I think it gives us a really good basis to go into it. I guess without getting into too many details about the Israel-Palestinian conflict, which obviously has a whole range of complexities involved, I guess my first question, when you mentioned that that essentially is where the theory of enchantment came out of, how do you why did you think that there were overlaps that could be something that was originally founded to deal with what is essentially um, a a conflict of multiple layers, different nations, of war, in many ways. Why did you think that that could be applied in the context of the US?
Well, I will say that partially it was because other people were telling me that it could be applied. But I guess more to the point of your question, I think it can be applied because fundamentally, whether we're talking about that conflict or whether we're talking about how to overcome incredibly, incredibly rich and complex histories of groups of people oppressing other groups of people, and how we deal with repairing the relationships between groups of people that have been oppressed by other groups of people. I think that theory of enchantment essentially has a very, or starts at a very specific starting point, which is unique, which is that supremacy or supremacist ways of being, supremacist ways of perceiving other, or perceiving the world and perceiving the stranger, the supremacist ways of being are fundamentally a coping mechanism to deal with pain. I think that is the unique premise that we begin with that applies to many conflicts around the world, but also within the United States. And I think that it is incumbent upon people to understand this, because if we don't understand this, we will end up perpetuating the very conditions we seek to undermine to bring about a more just society.
So I think that kind of brings me nicely into the next question, because I think trying to think about how theory of enchantment differs
Mm-hmm.
to the other approaches, as you mentioned, there's this universal theme that underpins it, and that this idea that we are all humans, which of course we are, and that there are certain desires, needs, challenges that we all face and we all struggle with as individuals, in our own conscience in our lives. And I think that in terms of your critique of the other approaches, how do you see the other approaches and where they differ? Because that universal view and approach you take already sets you apart in
Mm-hmm.
a context which I think is very much focused on our fundamental differences and how they're often irreconcilable. So,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, could you expand on that?
Yeah, so I would say that many of the other approaches speak in caricatures. And this is breaking the first principle of the theory of enchantment, right? Many people who are DEI consultants who come from other philosophies, for example, the Kindi/D'Angelo philosophy, will speak in wholesale condescending language when speaking about white people, for example. When speaking about quote unquote cisgender straight white males, they will speak with a type of language that is ultimately, I think, dehumanizing to that community, uh, in an attempt to bring about justice for people of color, for people who belong to minority backgrounds. And the reason why that is fundamentally not going to work, right? Not only is it, I would argue, unethical, but it's not going to work because of something that James Baldwin observed, which is that we cling to our hatred as human beings. We reach for hatred because we sense that once hatred is gone, we will have to deal with pain. If I am feeling insecure about who I am as a human being, if I am feeling a lack of worthiness, a lack of a sense of meaning within my own psyche, within my own core, and I don't have the proper tools to be able to deal with that feeling, to process that feeling. We all feel insecure at times as human beings. This is part of what it means to be human. But if I don't have the proper tools to deal with that feeling and to transmute that feeling into something else, then I will cope by projecting my insecurities onto other human beings. I will simply say other people who don't look like me are good, and other people who do look, or excuse me, other people who don't look like me are bad, right? And other people who do look like me are good. Other people who believe the way I believe are good. Other people who don't believe the way I believe are bad. This is a very simple heuristic that we reach for as human beings to cope with what seems to be like the overwhelming chaos of the unknown. And I see that I hear that reflected in the language of this other model. When people are speaking, expressing themselves, or expressing towards white people in very denigrating, using very denigrating caricatured terminology. And that terminology is dangerous because it actually creates the conditions for more insecurity and more feelings of worthlessness within that community that can then be projected onto us as people of color and continue the cycle of hatred and prejudice and bigotry. It does not actually transmute the negative experience of prejudice. It perpetuates it in the name of ending it in the first place.
So my question then is that, so I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and our project, the Equiano Project, is named after a 18th century writer and abolitionist, Lauda Equiano, and he was a slave, and he often talked about the fact that slavery not only had a corrupting force on the slave owner as well, for what it did to their humanity. But what do you say to those who say that, in a way, it could be construed as placing the responsibility on those that are victimized, insofar as saying that we need to think about how we approach these issues. In a way, some people would think, well, some people are just going about their business and they're being subject to discrimination, oppression, hatred, and why is the onus on them to reflect psychologically, if that makes sense?
I think it does make sense. And I think it is a valid question. And it is a important question that I want to answer appropriately. I understand that the experience of persecution can, from a somatic perspective, and does, from a somatic perspective, from a psychological perspective, deeply impact the person or the group of people being persecuted. And it is profoundly painful, and it is profoundly sorrowful, actually. And because I think the ultimate quest for every human being, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your ethnic background, the ultimate quest of every human being is how do I respond holistically and in an integrated fashion to what is happening to me in the current moment. Regardless of the context that I find myself in, it is my responsibility as a whole human being to ask that question. And by the way, it is also the responsibility of human beings who find themselves not being persecuted, right? It is the responsibility of every human being to ask themselves, how do I respond in an integrated, holistic fashion with whatever is occurring to me in such a way that doesn't perpetuate injustice. And so it's not as if there's greater responsibility on the people who are being persecuted than on the folks who are doing the persecuting, but rather that everyone is responsible. All human beings are responsible to ask themselves these questions. And I keep using that word because I think it's an important word. Like, like you said, why is the responsibility on us? I think there's an incredible distinction between responsibility and reactivity. And one of the incredible things that makes being human a miracle is our ability to respond, right? Is our ability to make the conscious choice to respond. as opposed to reacting, as opposed to taking what is done to us and simply reacting it out, right?
Mm.
Towards someone else. There's a difference between that and taking what's happening to us, being present with what feelings are arising within us, and making a conscious choice not to mirror those same actions, but to respond differently. And that is a part of what makes us autonomous beings. That's a part of what makes us agents, psychological agents, and not simply people who are at the whims, who are operating at the whims of everyone else. And I think it speaks to the dignity of what it means to be human, to be able to make that conscious choice.
On that point about being a psychological agent, I think that's a very interesting one. And I think so my question is, I guess, why did you think a psychological approach was the best approach rather than perhaps a political or a
Mm.
historical approach? 'Cause I guess some people might think that, if we look at some of the big developments in American history, the abolition of slavery and then the civil rights movement, these how is psychology always the yeah, how would you view that psychologically,
Mm.
and why do you think that for you was an important approach to addressing this over perhaps the political or historical one, as I said?
I think that oftentimes, I know that the rhetoric that I hear in these spaces is we need to destroy the system or we need to reform the system. And people act as if institutional systems are separate from this human system, which operates according to very, I think, specific laws and logic. And the absence of awareness of this deeply human psychological system is a fundamental flaw. And I think that people who were leaders in the civil rights movement, especially, understood the psychological system. Dr. King and the young adults who were active in protesting segregation, who were active in protesting Jim Crow laws in the South, were very aware of human psychology, and they decided to practice what Reinhold Niebuhr, famous theologian of the 20th century, called a spiritual discipline against the politics of resentment. And so they knew that when protesting supremacy, if they weren't careful in guarding themselves, they could then become prejudiced against the very people whose behavior they were protesting. They knew this. They knew that they could become the very thing that the very behavior they could embody that they detested. And they wanted to guard themselves against it. So I would say that in many ways, Theory of Enchantment is attempting to continue to embody the heritage and the legacy of the civil rights movement. Dr. King said that agape love, which is a Greek term that comes from the Christian wisdom tradition, that is this notion of unconditional love, was the ideal of the civil rights movement, right? He said specifically that it was the aim of the civil rights movement. And I think this is really important to point out. Although we are extremely grateful, and we should be, for the 1964 Civil Rights Act, although we are extremely grateful, and we should be, for the desegregation, right, of institutions, places of worship, etc. in this country, all of those things were the outcome of what was the ultimate ideal of the civil rights movement, which was the embodied practice of unconditional love. And people often miss that when we talk about the history of the civil rights movement, when we celebrate the anniversary of Dr. King. We miss the psychological piece, and we miss the ultimate principle that the civil rights movement was trying to carry forward, was trying to birth, quite frankly, within the American ethos, which is this notion of unconditional love, which is deeply difficult to practice and embody. First for oneself, let alone for others.
When you were speaking just then, it really did make me think of Christianity. You know, I'm not a religious person as such, but I know that many of the leaders of the civil rights movement were deeply inspired and deeply informed by Christian ethics. And a lot of what you say there, to me at least, has a deeply kind of Christian ethic behind it. The universality of the human kingdom of love, and the possibility for all of us to reach a form of transcendence and so on. How do you how do how do you reconcile that? How do you think that lands in a context of that's increasingly secularized, increasingly even de-Christianized? Um, yeah, what do you make of the relationship with something that, at least, correct me if I'm wrong, has a strong Christian influence in a society that seems increasingly estranged from those kinds of ideals and those kinds of values?
I have a perhaps naive view on this, which is that even though I think that the facade is that we are deeply secular, but, and I take the point that Tom Holland makes it in his, Tom Holland wrote a book called Dominion, which
Yeah.
is, exploring how pervasive actually Christian thought is in both the left and the right, actually, which I find fascinating. But I think we're still a deeply Christian society. I think that our values are still very deeply informed by Christianity. But I also think that people are able to recognize, even without having a Christian lens, some of the truth of what I say. So, like, when I speak to medical professionals, or I speak to folks who have some sort of connection with, let's say, Alcoholics Anonymous or drug rehabilitation programs, they understand what I mean when I say that supremacy is a coping mechanism for pain, because they have seen that and how that manifests in other contexts and in other circumstances. They have seen how, just even from a scientific perspective, the feeling of hatred can be a way, or can actually be a chemical that overtakes us as a way to deal with pain. So even if folks aren't, religious, even if folks are secular or, consider themselves to be pretty glued in or tapped into the scientific community, there's a scientific sort of like plug-in for what I'm saying, even absent the sort of religious lens that other people have used to come to the conclusions that I've come to.
Because I was seeing that as a positive thing, because I think that in a way, um, the I think that that's a challenge at the moment,
Mm,
because religion, at least before, had that higher ideal, that universal ethic, that everyone around you is broadly of the same philosophical or religious outlet. And now we don't seem to have those things that give us full trust in where
mm,
someone's coming from. And I think that, because whilst we can appeal to the human, which I think is important, and I very much recognize that, in another way we are different. We do come from we're speaking from different countries. People might have different origins and histories and stories. And so I guess, how far can the appeal to our humanity take us when there is a real reality of difference? And if we don't have some kind of um governing ethic which
mhm,
takes us outside of ourselves,
mhm,
then that, I think, can often lead us to just grab for different tribalist
mhm.
identities. So what do you make of that? That is the appeal to the human enough to take us away from our deeply held identity groups, or our deeply held um, political abstractions, identities, and so on?
I think it can be, because in fact it's deeply human to hold on to the tribe, right? It's actually deeply human to hold on to those political identities. It's deeply human to hold on to those containers in which we feel like we belong, like we love, like we are like we matter, right? So even in that very oftentimes unhealthy expression, uh, is still at root a deeply human need that is reflected in, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, we need food, we need water, we need shelter, we need safety, we need security, we need belonging. This is all true universally, and in fact, when we cling to that tribe that makes us feel safe or that ideology that makes us feel seen, we are still reaffirming something very universal about the human experience, many things that are universal about the human experience, but one of which is that when we experience scarcity, when our needs are not met, the likelihood that we will cling to an extremist viewpoint increases. And so I think that there's something even enchanting about knowing that fact, right? About even being able to see in the midst of people clinging to terrible ideologies, quite frankly, right? Dehumanizing ideologies. There's actually, again, something deeply human about that. And if you can start to trace the origin of how pain point manifested in that, then I think we can start to solve the problem. But again, this is my worldview. I know that it won't appeal to everyone. I'm taking my biases and my lenses and my perspectives and coming to the conclusions that I'm coming to. But as a result of, continuing the practices in Theory of Enchantment, I'm able to see how even when people are being absolutely absurd, there's something really deeply human about how their pain points are manifesting.
So when you do these sessions or workshops that you do, what are you hoping? What are you hoping are the outcomes? What are the kinds of things that you see as a result of doing these workshops with people?
Mm. Well, some of the outcomes we've seen, not only from doing the workshops, but also from having people enroll in our online curriculum, is people are seeing how they can be overwhelmed by feelings of like anger or resentment or mistrust, even in the workplace, whether it's on ethnic lines or on hierarchical lines, right? Like I'm a manager and I know I have to go tell my employee that they're not showing up in the right way, but I don't know how to do that. And actually taking this course enabled me or equipped me with some tools to be able to do that. So we're seeing some of those outcomes. Also, one of the outcomes that we're seeing and that I hope to seed through Theory of Enchantment is a general orientation of awe and wonder about what it means to be alive and what it means to be human. I think oftentimes when we are confronted with the unknown, we are overwhelmed by a sense of terror and we don't know how to navigate that. And so Theory of Enchantment helps to or tries to help equip people with a roadmap or with tools that they can use to navigate the unknown, that in a way that opens them up to awe and wonder and enchantment, as opposed to closing them down and making them feel separation from their neighbor, separation from their colleague who has a different political opinion from them, separation from their colleague who has a different opinion on how to approach diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So there's a lot of far-reaching places I think we can go, but it's not only an intellectual exercise, right? It's also a felt sense of connection, a felt sense of, oh, I don't necessarily agree with you, but I could see how you came to the conclusions that you came to, and I can see how the experience of not belonging or the experience of, not feeling like your needs were being met might have led you to this conclusion. And I'm going to be vulnerable and share with you my own experiences of that and how I came to the conclusions I've come to. And maybe we can actually experience a through line between our two positions and see where we connect. So that's really the outcome that we're trying to have happen organically by having people interact with our courses, our workshops, etc.
So we're a UK organisation, as I think you might know already. And I think it's very interesting hearing you say this because it makes me then think, is the America that I think a lot of British people hear about in the news and politics and so on really the way it is, which is that it is so divided, it is so polarized at the moment, where it really needs organizations like the Theory of Enchantment to remind Americans, remind people that we're a common humanity, that just because someone disagrees with you doesn't mean that they are fundamentally an evil person, and that actually we all struggle with our own complexities and our own contradictions internally and so on. And so do you think America is at a really worrying point? Now, there are some people that they could be just saying they could be being exaggerating, but some people say there's a real potential of real violence in America because of the political divides that is going on. So I guess my question is, um, the assumption of the theory of enchantment, as circling back to what we said in the beginning, obviously it came out of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Do you then feel that America is that divided, is that polarized, where those basic fundamental questions of reminding us of our humanity is we need to go back to that starting point because what the direction it's on is completely diverting away from that.
I mean, yes and no. I think that if you were to look at America through the lens of social media, it certainly would seem that we are at each other's throats, depending upon your channel of choice. But I work with, many different companies and individuals and nonprofits, and the tone is very different
Mm.
that I experience in working with them. So I think that there's a quality of being that exists in extremely online communities where you're not seeing the person face to face, you're not interacting with them as a flesh and blood, full human being. You're interacting oftentimes with text, uh, in the case of Twitter, for example, or you're siloed in a way that you can't really be siloed when you're encountering people face to face or in person or even on Zoom. So I don't know, like it's hard for me to read whether or not we are in fact as divided as people claim we are. I also see these patterns happening where folks on the extreme left and folks on the extreme right come to the same conclusions about each other, even though they're like opposed to each other, but they come to the same conclusions about the tactics they need to use, or you see so-called enemies start to unconsciously imitate each other, which we teach about in Theory of Enchantment. So I don't know. It's like I don't know how I can't really gauge how deep the polarization is within my country, but I can say that regardless of the times, we need to be doing work that makes us integrated. And in the United States, I don't know about the UK, but in the United States, this term has a very specific, weight to it because of our history. But it seems to me that we devoted a great deal to integration on a policy level, but not necessarily integration on a psychological level. And integration on a psychological level means me as an individual, you as an individual, me in community, you in community, getting in right relationship with ourselves so that we don't project our insecurities onto others as a way to cope with pain. And that's very long work. That's very long-term work. It's not achieved by like an imposition of a top-down policy. It's simply not. It requires up-down from the bottom up, intentional long-term work in community. And I think one of the byproducts of being extremely online is we forget that that work is needed in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's very good that you mentioned social media and online because I think that that is undoubtedly a place which has, as you mentioned, so eloquently contributed to the sense of people as abstractions, online identities that people retreating into silos and echo chambers. I mean, what role do you think that has had? Because on the one hand, social media has been fantastic. We're on this podcast. There's been an explosion of lots of discussions, but there is that tension there, and it's something that I've been really struggling with, and I've spoken about it on when I spoke to Helen Pluckrose very recently, and I was saying to her that I've always been a very big free speech advocate, but in a straight, like weirdly, Elon Musk taking over Twitter has actually has unleashed. I mean, I could be wrong, but I get the sense that it has unleashed a bunch of racist, misogynist, except name the phobe, it has unleashed it, and it's really made me just think, like, it's really challenged my principles. I'm just like, I don't really want to see this, and so yeah, I guess my question is, what role do you think social media has had, and how is it more difficult to stick as well to fundamental principles now because of just the new territory that we're in?
So my friend Tobias Rose Stockwell just wrote a book that everyone should read called Outrage Machine. And he used to work in tech. He might technically still work in tech, but he was one of the people who was helping to design and develop these systems. So he knows how the systems work algorithmically. And the systems, especially in a place like Twitter or X, is historically speaking, at least, I don't know how Elon is going to change it, but historically speaking, it's designed to incentivize outrage because it's designed to help people express empathy. And empathy and outrage are actually very closely related from an evolutionary perspective. If I can get you to empathize with Israelis, then I can get you to be outraged in a dehumanizing way against Palestinians, and vice versa. And so I have found that simply being aware of how these systems work and what these systems are designed to do helps me have a relatively cooler head when I am on the systems. Because I'm aware in which my buttons are trying to be pushed, right? I'm aware that other people are not aware of this, right? So oftentimes they're speaking from a place of ignorance. And that simple awareness helps, at least to a certain extent, ground me and help me be intentional when I'm on these platforms. But yeah, and then you add in, like, if you can amass a certain amount of followers and a certain amount of likes, and you can convert that into money, you add the financial systems that are scaffolded on top of that, and you have a terrible situation. And that requires people to be super conscious about their actions on social media. So I think half the battle is just getting people to be aware of how the systems work. The system is incentivized or the system is designed to incentivize you to be outraged all the time. And so I think it is an incredible act of resistance to refuse to be outraged all the time and to look for the humanity in your enemy when you're on these platforms and you're opining on what's happening, including, not to be over dramatic, but including, if I perceive Ibram Kendi as my enemy, or if I perceive Robin DiAngelo as my enemy, it is incumbent upon me to see the humanity in them, even as I critique their ideas and their conclusions.
That really nicely brings me on to my final question, because isn't what you're calling for in many ways a heroic act, or even something beyond what our everyday human psychology asks of us? Because as humans, we're not infallible. We have shortcomings. We have biases. We have all of these things that we just inherit by virtue of our humanity, and therefore, is it too difficult to ask us to be not only be aware of that, but seek to overcome that? Are we always just not going to be limited by how we are as humans, or is that too pessimistic? I don't know.
It's a great question that you ask, Inaya. I love how you put it. I do believe it is a heroic act, that I am calling upon people. I am summoning people to rise to their higher selves. And it is a heroic act, not just in a metaphorical sense. The limbic system in the back of our brains is millions of years old. Right? The limbic system is designed to get us into fight or flight mode in the face of danger or perceived danger. And one of the problems is that we confuse real danger for perceived danger, and we will get into that fight or flight mode unconsciously, automatically. It's a reaction. And so it is, I think, the heroic cause of our time to bring conscious attention to this system that is operating. And I do think it is possible to overcome some of those things that you articulated if enough people dedicate themselves to overcoming it. But it is an incredibly difficult thing to do, and it is an incredibly heroic act. And I am, my roommate and I were talking about Lord of the Rings this weekend with everything happening in Israel-Palestine. We're talking about, I don't know if you've seen Lord of the Rings, but in the
I'm sad to admit I haven't, even though it's incredibly popular.
Okay, well, highly recommended. The third film is scene after scene after scene of Gandalf and his band of teammates calling people, summoning people to become their higher selves. And this is what Theory of Enchantment is trying to do. And again, I want to reiterate that in as much as I am a teacher, I am a student also. I know that this is incredibly difficult work, incredibly difficult to love your enemy. But this, I think, is the great cause of our time. And I really think we will perish. We will descend into chaos. We will descend into civil war. We will descend into extremism responding to extremism if we do not heed the call to learn to love our enemies, which begins with the profound act of learning to love ourselves.
Zoe, Valdary, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy our videos, why not leave a like and hit the subscribe and notification bell so you make sure that you do not miss an episode.